Hello and welcome back. In our next session, we're delighted to keep talking to the importance of emissions and working towards the idea of transportation net zero. The title for this session is The Future of Green Mobility. We've got a phenomenal panel with our Guidehouse, Vision, Ridge Partners and the GSA. Our moderator today is Matt Peterson, who's the Chief Executive Officer with Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator. So Matt, a very warm welcome and over to you.
Thank you. It's good to be back on the virtual stage here for your conference. Just to frame this conversation before I turn to the panel, our organization has convened the Transportation Electrification Partnership, which we talked about in last year's conference. And the aim of the partnership is a public-private partnership to accelerate the move to zero emissions, mobility and goods movement. And given 40% of all the goods come into the US through the ports of LA and Long Beach, we have an enormous responsibility in this region to not only lead the way as we do as being having the most EVs on the road of any region in the country, but we have the responsibility to lead on goods movement as well. I think today we'll probably talk more about personal mobility and the electrification of light duty fleet vehicles on the road in the United States. And beyond, but just a moment on the challenges that we face to get to the targets that we've set by the time the world arrives in Los Angeles for the Olympics in 2028, and that's how do we get enough chargers in place? Of course, we're well ahead of the rest of the country as well, but we have a long way to go to get to our target of 80% of all the cars sold in Los Angeles County, 10 million people in our region in the county, for 80% of the cars to be sold to be electric, fully battery electric. And that's really, when we set this target in 2018, it was seen as a very aggressive target, and it still is, but it's now really the glide path to how are we going to get to the 2035 goal of all only electric cars sold in California, and really helping President Biden reach the 40 to 50% of all the cars sold to be electric by 2030. So we have a lot of work to do in this region, and we're hard at work to both ensure equity and access. And then finally, in April of 2020, our partnership, it's made up of California Air Resources Board, the Mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, the County of Los Angeles, our Regional Metropolitan Transit Authority, to the utilities, Southern California Edison and DWP, and a number of automakers like Audi, BMW, Nissan, BYD, Proterra, and others, along with other local cities and labor, local IBW 11, put forth a proposal to congressional leaders to get $150 billion in federal stimulus in place for a comprehensive strategy to really move it. So in April 2020, we put that out there, the most detailed call for stimulus at the time. And it's now we've seen, incredible ambition in the Biden administration, though we're, of course, all waiting to see if Senator Manchin and Sinema will let aggressive climate package come through the Senate as we need to, as the president prepares to go to Glasgow along with Envoy John Kerry. So that is all framed. We know transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in LA. It's also the largest source of air pollution with goods movement. So I want to turn to this great panel, and I'm going to start with Ajay Chawan, Associate Director of Guidehouse, to really just share a little bit of thoughts to the point that I began to touch on. What's the role of national policy or federal policy in enabling the technology advancements that we need to see to reduce emissions?
First of all, thank you for the question, Matt, and thank you to Reuters for hosting this and inviting us, and to my fellow panelists. Looking forward to the conversation today. So the way that our group views national policy, first of all, it provides an element of certainty. And so if there is policy that is going to establish what the rules of the playing field are, maybe perhaps guardrails of what the market is going to be like, that enables stakeholders to act accordingly, specifically make investments in that direction. A great example of that is the tax credit, the 30D tax credit for electric vehicles. In my previous life, working at a couple of different automakers, we use that credit in our business plan to model how many vehicles we could get on the market. So to support the targets that you had mentioned earlier, Matt, of getting 40 to 50% of vehicles on the road, each, that's driveway by driveway, we need to make that business case. And that's where certainty in the market can help, and that's where the federal policies can help. So that's the first item. Second item, it's really about the stimulation, of key technology enablers to provide to provide direction of what is needed. So not necessarily picking winners of one tech over the other, but enabling advanced technology advances to proceed and demonstrate the feasibility of the entire market. And a great example of that is the DOE's program, that it's the many programs that it has, but one in particular is the advanced cell recycling program that it is pioneering to help address the challenge of recycling lithium-ion batteries as more and more electric vehicles come on the road, then eventually come off the road. And then lastly, from a leading by example standpoint, the policymakers, the federal and state level are if they can lead by example, it provides assurance to the market that this is the direction we're going in. So Charlotte and her colleagues are supporting, are leading the effort to execute President Biden's executive order to electrify the federal fleet, which is over 200,000 vehicles spread across the United States and its territories. So when the U.S. government can say we are committed to this direction, and we're going to do it at scale at which we can do, because no single entity has the ability to do it, they're doing it. They're bringing the right partners together to enable that to enable that transformation.
Excellent. Thank you, RJ. And your firm has done some great work, including for our to help us do the modeling and set the targets that we put forth in our zero emissions roadmap. So thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Turning next to Emma Russell, who's a principal of Vision Ridge, working on mobility and electrification. Talk to us about the power of regulation versus incentives, the stick versus the carrot, and also the differences in in those tools for the public and private sector.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Matt. So I really do believe that both that carrot and stick are integral to really catalyzing the opportunity in order to bring in private capital in many instances. And so I think that they really need to work together in a holistic framework where you have regulation and incentives working hand in glove. And the issue here being that where the economics don't yet make sense for private capital, there's this implicit incentive for folks to wait. And we see this with deadlines around, for example, decarbonizing airports in California, or even more broadly as we think about the Paris Climate Agreement. And so we have this scenario where you creep closer and closer to the deadline, and it becomes evident that the goals aren't going to be met. And then either the goals are cut back or the deadlines are pushed. Alternatively, incentives, unless very strictly drafted, and this is actually really hard to do, they often have perverse impacts on the market. And I think one example around this that I'd highlight is on school bus electrification. One of the main, if not the main, impediment to green initiatives is really this chicken and egg problem that we have on new technologies. There's low demand because the tech is too expensive, but costs can't come down until demand really scales. So how do you solve that? And what we've seen in school bus electrification is that the battery electric version of the model is, 2x plus the price of its diesel counterpart. And so various programs have created pockets of money available that are intended to defray this additional cost. But what we've been seeing time and time again is that these programs are inefficiently designed, and schools are getting, free or near free buses, but all in this kind of onesie-twosie context. And so there are big dollars going towards really small numbers. And this is really inefficient because it doesn't help manufacturers scale their volume and help bring down that price curve. And so I think what we need to do is be drafting regulation and incentives with a mind to how do we really put the focus on return on investment of that concessionary capital? Are you getting the most bang for your buck through those programs? And I think by creating that marriage between regulation and incentive, that's really where you can best address that.
Excellent. Yeah, I think we see that in California, obviously, quite a bit as CARB tries to ratchet down and push to meet the governor's goals, and then we continue on the incentive side. Hopefully we can take what we've learned, what works and what doesn't work as well here in California, and replicate it elsewhere. Speaking of a big job to do, Charlotte Phelan, you have a big job, as was noted by RJ, to implement the president's executive order to electrify the federal fleet. What does it mean, really, when we hear that term, greening the federal fleet?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. That's a great question. When President Biden signed the executive order in January to convert the federal fleet to all electric vehicles within the following 6 years, it really put GSA on point to work in that goal and make it happen. And our role at GSA is to help transition all non-tactical, non-postal federal government vehicles over to electric models that run on renewable energy and have low or no carbon emissions. I really sincerely believe that when the federal government uses its resource to support projects like electric vehicles, it creates opportunities for private industry to continue developing new products. And the federal fleet is perfectly positioned to lead from the front and serve as an early adopter for electrification. The federal fleet is made up of more than 450,000 non-postal vehicles that are either GSA leased or agency owned. More than 226,000 are in the leased fleet, and the 223,000 are in the agency-owned fleet. And by incorporating new, more efficient, advanced technology vehicles and electric vehicles, it shows our federal partners and the general public that we are all in on electrification. The other benefit that it does is it also sets up a robust market for innovation, both in the government and in the private sector, with which both Ajay and Emma referenced.
Thank you. Yeah, I know firsthand the challenge, even when you've got the boss, so to speak, the president of the United States saying we got to head this direction. It's not a simple task. And when I was chief sustainability officer for the city of Los Angeles, we set a commitment to buy all of our new cars in the fleet to be 50% electric each year. And just, getting people used to it, getting through the procurement process, it takes some time and, of course, leadership. So thank you for your work. Turning back to you, RJ, talk to us a little bit about your thoughts and how do we coordinate efforts with different stakeholders to, whether it's OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, power suppliers, as well as consumers, to really green mobility?
I think actually this is a playbook that's currently being written as we all speak. I think the folks that are on this panel and are going to be participating in this summit overall are all members of this overall ecosystem. And the challenges that we have are getting everyone to work together. As we transform the mobility space, and we're not just electrification, but we like to think about it in the ACEs categories of autonomous, connected, electric, and shared. And all these four megatrends are very much intertwined. Electrification is the one that's coming first, and it's just a given that electric drive will be the powertrain of choice for these more advanced vehicles that are on the road today and will be continuing to be introduced to the market. So the challenges that we're addressing are first around getting these different parties to coordinate, so the people side of it. In my previous life at 3 automakers, we built cars that ran on fossil fuels. We never really had to work with electric utility companies. Now we do, because we are now at automakers are announcing ambitious electrification targets of their fleet of 25, 50, 100% of sales will be electric in the next 10 to 15 years. The electric grid side is saying, great targets, but you need to talk to us about this, since we're going to be delivering all this power, which is significant. So that's the the first, like the first key item. The second is the, like, say, tools and platforms, we would say. So how can we ensure effective communication and coordination amongst these various stakeholders? So new technology standards are being developed, such as OpenADR, ISO 15118, to enable that all these different items that we're plugging into the larger Internet of Things are going to continue to speak to one another and be better coordinated, which will improve energy efficiency, which will improve safety, and will enable these new technologies to come out there. And that leads into the governance side of it, where the role that the federal government can play, as well as the other standard bearers in the industry, such as SAE and other groups that develop communication standards, safety standards, and so forth, will share what they're working on, and hopefully lead to adoption by these stakeholders. So that, I think, is the long way of saying, like, we don't have a playbook today, but there are many folks here that are participating, that are members of this ecosystem, that are coming together in forums like this and in other working groups to develop that playbook.
Thank you, RJ. Yeah, I mean, when we look at just something that is seemingly as simple yet important as getting a fast charger installed, making sure you're communicating with the utility that there's available power and adequate power, and then planning for the time it takes to get additional power if that's really where that charger needs to go. So how do we optimize? There are plenty of lessons we're learning out here, particularly as we move to heavy duty trucks moving to battery electric vehicles. We have about 100 trucks about to hit the road, a dozen on the road already, to run the short drayage runs from the port to warehouses close to the port. So a lot to figure out, but we need to move quickly.
I would say, like, if I could, like, one last thing I'd add, Matt, is like the 2 points there to add is like what the we have to always keep in mind what is important to the end users. They need to be able to achieve the primary mission of what that vehicle is supposed to do, whether it's supposed to carry people, carry goods, or whatever else. Yep. It has to be able to do that, and do that in a reliable manner, and has to do it in a cost-effective manner. So predictability and reliability are two cornerstones that of an overall plan.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And by the way, if anybody has any comments on the panel as we move to between questions, please jump in if there's a topic you want to weigh in on. Emma, getting private capital off the sidelines in some of these spaces, particularly, again, goods movement, and we're seeing it begin to happen more on the light duty side, but we still have a ways to go. We work a lot with startups, of course, as well as with corporates on how to get innovation on the road. We created this zero emissions delivery zone with the city of Santa Monica, the first in the country, and we're bringing some new solutions to the fore. And part of the challenge is just, how do you come up with sort of the innovative financing sometimes needed, whether it's non-dilutive grant capital or debt financing or investment. Talk to us about how grants or other concessionary capital can be used most efficiently to leverage impact and the investment that is coming from, and one we know at some level is going to come from the federal government.
Yeah, sure. So one country that I've seen do this really well is Norway. They're obviously a major leader in all things sustainable. But as an example, we have an investment in Phelan, which is the largest dairy company in Norway. And Norway made it a priority that they decarbonize within their World Heritage fjords. They're the pride of the country, and it's an area they want to keep pristine. And so what they did was effectively put in place requirements whereby the ferries serving those routes needed to meet certain emissions requirements. And how that was actually helped financed and passed along was by increasing effectively the dollars that were available for the contracts to help defray the higher cost of investment in the vessels that would then serve these routes. And it was a really neat and efficient way, actually, to put in that regulation, that stick, if you will, but then provide the carrot or the funding that made it all possible. And in doing so, it attracted capital such as ours, because all of a sudden we have this super interesting, sustainable new mobility company. And we invested in Shortgården with an eye to helping expand that business model in other contexts outside of Norway, and hopefully bringing low carbon maritime solutions to an international scale.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Claire, Charlotte, excuse me, back to you. The federal fleet can't benefit from the private sector investing directly. Obviously, you do have some private sector partnerships and utilization, work with the private sector quite a bit to bring these vehicles into the fleet and get the charging in place. But it's a big job. Even with all this help, and let's say you get the funding you need out of the reconciliation package or the bipartisan framework, what are some of the challenges you face even with the resources to advance towards your goals?
Matt, that's a great question. I often think back to Steve Jobs, who said the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. And that's why, to me personally, it is so exciting to be part of this great initiative. Like we're moving forward and something that's going to impact our children and our children's children, and truly will be a catalyst for real climate change in the nation. And it's such an honor to be a part of that. But you're right, there are some big challenges, and we are proactively working to meet those. Some of the things that we're doing, it really starts, both my fellow panelists mentioned this, it starts with relationships, and who are those private partnerships that we can form. I work very closely with CEQ, DOE, DOT, the climate advisors, the automotive manufacturers, the EVSE vendors. We participate in a multitude of working groups that are truly working to advance culture change, because I think we've kind of stepped around that a little bit, but there's this real thing called range anxiety, and just the act of changing from something that's been so ingrained, fossil fuel vehicles in our culture, to this new technology is really daunting for people. So we have internal GSA infrastructure working groups. We work with CEQ in the White House on both a sprint and technical teams on how are we going to execute, how are we going to put lasting change in place. We co-lead the Federal Electric Vehicle Agency Roundtable. And then my group specifically hosts a big event every year called FedFleet. And this past year was all on electrification. So our audience of other agency participated in it. We provided big training events on what does it mean to convert to an all-electric fleet, and what will the impacts be to accomplishing the mission, like my fellow panelists mentioned. We've really been aggressive. Over the past year, we've increased the number of ZEVs that we offer our partners by 161%.
Wow.
We jumped from 13 to 34 ZEV models in just 1 year. We have 28 now battery electric vehicles on offer. We actually have 1 fuel cell vehicle on offer and 5 plug-in hybrid vehicles. And this is just a moment in time. Like I'm just giving you a snapshot, because as industry brings their offerings to market, we're going to get them on contract and have them available for the agencies to actually procure or lease from GSA. The biggest part of this, and I think we've kind of hinted at it, is the EV infrastructure. It's really the more complicated part of electrifying the federal fleet. We are working very closely with our GSA Public Building Services team, which is really fortunate that we're in the same agency and we can collaborate so closely, because there are so many details that have to be considered. It goes way beyond just pulling a permit and calling it a day. There'll be a multitude of site assessments, landscape and environmental evaluations, considerations of what other infrastructure, both above and below ground, are there, local and state regulations, and just so much more. And then on top of it, for the federal government, we have all the considerations of the historic buildings and everything that goes in with those requirements. Every single location will have different challenges, and all of those have to be addressed individually. So it's an enormous undertaking, and it's as important, or in my estimation, even more important than just the vehicles themselves.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Charlotte. That's really illuminating. And the task is so important and urgent, given that not only the lives and lungs of whether school children riding dirty diesel buses, or those that live along, busy freeways and roadways that have to breathe this dirty air that comes currently from our cars and trucks. But how do we tackle the climate crisis head on? Transportation is key, and it touches every aspect of our lives and our economy, and it's an exciting opportunity, and it's so important. So it's so great we have so many incredible people like you working on it at the federal level. Quick question to follow up. I know my experience of working with different departments from the city of LA. You say you have different vehicles on offer. I know the Climate Mayors, a group of US mayors, has created a purchasing collective to make it easier for cities to procure EVs, particularly those that aren't in EV states currently, like California, where vehicles are less available. Let's say I'm a HUD regional office and I need 10 cars for my inspectors. Do I call Charlotte up and say, hey, Charlotte, how do I get 10 EVs? How does that process work?
So our federal customers we're already in relationship with them. We work with their managers on a daily basis, and they know where to go. We do have some limited by law ability to support state and local and tribal entities. So we do that where we can as well. And we hope to expand that even more. But it is as far as the federal government goes, we're pretty closely aligned, and they've been dealing with us for, the federal fleet has been in existence for over 30 years. So those relationships are well established and easily done by our federal agency customers.
Thank you. A question for everybody from the audience. The question is, what is the vision of the pathway and time frame of the battery electric vehicle industry to be self-sufficient without government subsidies? I'll start with a comment as you think about how to answer this question. I think in having been an advocate and also practitioner in deploying solar in the late 90s and the early aughts across the country, and an advocate for policy in California to prioritize funding a subsidy for solar on affordable housing and changing tax credit policy across the country to do that through LIHTC financing. What I've seen, clearly, I think we'll get to this point at some stage, as we did with solar, for the most part, and we're still putting some tax credits into the solar ecosystem, but the panels themselves have of course dropped precipitously, and now we need to see battery costs to come down. But the one area I think we're going to need to continue to subsidize is we're playing with a couple EV car share pilots that are round trip servicing housing authority residents, where you have a population that has inadequate access to transportation, period, let alone access to a private vehicle. And we know that there are some trips that you just can't do on the bus, particularly if you're going to have to take multiple lines. And so the EV car share program has been enormously successful, and we're looking at how do we help scale that. So to us, that's the right kind of subsidy long term, that you don't want to replace people taking transit, but how do you provide an alternative when they need it and they can't afford a car themselves, to make sure it's electric and affordable. But to all of you, what do you say to this question of the pathway and time frame to not require government subsidy for electric vehicles? RJ?
Yeah, so I'd start with you need to define clearly what does self-sufficiency mean from a vehicle only standpoint. the cost curve for battery cost curve is going in the right direction to make to help to enable a battery powered vehicle to be on price parity or at price parity with a internal combustion engine vehicle in the coming years. So definitely like in the second half of this decade is what the projections show. I think our projections show around 2026-ish. I need to go back and revisit those. So that's that part of it. The infrastructure piece of it that Charlotte had mentioned is a significant portion, and that's now bringing in the electric utility players who are now in the process of putting in new filings to help support the modernization of the grid, the hardening of the grid to protect against these more severe weather challenges that we're having. Think of the event in Texas earlier this year, so that you have the reliable source of energy to power these new vehicles. So that so defining the self-sufficiency, it brings in these other players that we mentioned earlier of when does this entire ecosystem become modernized. But from a vehicle standpoint, this decade for sure, for that, and that will enable businesses and other commercial customers and individual customers to make that financial justification to get into an electric vehicle. And the vehicles will be of great quality. They'll be able to perform as well, if not better, than their ICE counterparts. And so they can achieve their primary mission as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we see, Hertz certainly will benefit from whatever available subsidies there are at a state or federal level in their purchase of 100,000 Teslas. Tesla, I know firsthand, they don't provide discounts to anybody. And so they paid full freight, and of course we'll rely on those discounts. But a huge, not only for the Tesla stock price, but really for the industry and what that means to get more charging in place and the like. But Emma, what's your thoughts? What's price parity and the pathway, the off ramp to no longer need subsidy, at least on the vehicles?
Yeah, I was going to say, to RJ's point on how you define self-sufficiency, I think Tesla's market cap would probably argue that it's already there in some context. But I truly believe that really the long pole in the tent is on the infrastructure side, and particularly as we think about that in terms of a national system. We have clusters of really dense charging in places like LA, but you really need either regulation or concessionary capital in order to build out a charging system cross country. Because if you're doing a long haul trucking route, you need to be able to charge along the way. And right now, there's not the utilization in place in most parts of the country. And so obviously we see that with Electrify America coming out of the VW settlement is helping to create that system. But there needs to be a real acceleration on that side, I think, in order to really support electrification across different areas of the logistics chain. So to me, that would be the primary focus, and how do we get to self-sufficiency on a kind of a total terrestrial mobility sector basis.
Yeah, you raise a good point, which is the importance of in the heavy duty goods movement sector. We've really been pushing for more funding, pushing for federal funding, state funding, regional funding for that task along what's known as the 710, which both the ports of LA and Long Beach, the trucks and cargo containers coming off those ships go along and out to the Inland Empire and across the country. The logistics supply chain crisis has pointed out the vulnerability of the ecosystem. Yet as we move to 24/7 operations, that just means that much more pollution from the ships, the trains, the trucks, and our near-term opportunities, the trucks, and just underscores the urgency of figuring this out to move in this direction. Charlotte, how about you? What's your view? I mean, you've got the federal purse, and your approach is a little different if you're than in the private sector, but where do you see parity or no longer needing subsidy?
So I think Emma really highlighted the issue that we're facing. So we have to have infrastructure nationwide. The federal fleet is primarily a working fleet, and it's in the areas of the country that aren't necessarily urban or developed. You know, we have agricultural trucks and vehicles that are running ops on bases, et cetera. And they're not in areas where you traditionally see that infrastructure come and be built first. And so it is really a complex problem of how are we going to get the infrastructure, as Emma stated, nationwide? And how do we do that in a way, like Ajay stated, where it doesn't really have all these negative impacts on the grid? So it is a very complex problem. And I think I can't crystal ball how long subsidies are going to be needed, but they're going to be needed for a while, because we need to answer this initiative as one entity. It is truly a national response, and it's appropriate that the federal government participate in that national response. So I think the problems have been really articulated in the big plan that we have in front of us that to accomplish the electrification of the federal fleet and therefore the nation.
Yeah. Well, I think that takes us to about time. Really thoughtful and provocative answers and conversation. Thanks again to Reuters for inviting us to join you, and thank you to Emma, RJ, and Charlotte for taking the time to share their thoughts and the work that you do every day.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, and from Reuters, a thank you again to Charlotte, Emma, and RJ, of course.